Welcome to this presentation. Here we go. Welcome to this presentation. We're going to be covering the wonderful world of commas today. Let's get started talking about commas. In this course, we cover many different grammar and punctuation topics. I think three of the more challenging ones are passive voice, misplaced modifiers, and commas. I think probably the most challenging of those three is comma usage. And it is also probably the one that is most likely to, if you make an error, most likely to result in an ambiguous document. And so for that reason, it is probably the single most important topic, grammar / punctuation topic, that we're going to face in this class. I wish that the most important topic was also the easiest. That would make life lovely for all of us. But it is probably, arguably, the most challenging. If you are a whiz at commas, congratulations. I applaud you for that. Many of us, including myself, are not intuitive comma users, if there is such a thing. We struggle with it. I routinely check myself when I use a comma. Pretty commonly, I will refer to my rules. I don't produce much without having my handy dandy Aspen with me, or Google something, or something along those lines. I am constantly checking. If you are naturally awesome at this, maybe you don't have to check very often. If this isn't something that, if as we're going through this presentation, you think, oh, I didn't know that factor, or I didn't know how that worked, then that suggests that you're probably somebody who would benefit from being like me, from regularly checking. The wonderful thing about checking for comma usage is that every time you check, you develop a little bit stronger memory about the rules and a little bit deeper understanding. So it continues the learning process. It would be awesome if in this class you move to God or goddess level of comma usage. That would be great and wonderful, and your grade will reflect it, and so that's awesome. But that's not really why we're here. We're not here so that you can get an A in the course. We're here so that you can get an A in your career, right? So if you learn these rules just kind of, sort of enough to do well on assignments, that doesn't get us very far. I want you to be able to translate this knowledge into the workforce. A good thing to think about with respect to commas is that you don't have to memorize the rules. In the real world, you're going to have resources handy. And it's going to be rare that you are so stressed for time that you can't flip to that dog-eared page in your book and look at the rule. In fact, what I had in my office when I was in practice was I had a 2-page, back and front page, which I laminated with my comma rules on it. It was my version of the rules. It was, I think, it was something I had typed up. It wasn't even something I printed from some other resource. And it had a few examples to help me remember the rules. And that's what I used. And I would flip it over and look at it I hung it from a string and would flip it over both ways so I could see it quickly. That can be a very, very handy resource for you. So I encourage you to think in those terms. You want to have the resource available so that it's super easy for you to use. The more challenging you make it, the less likely you are to check the rule, and therefore you don't reinforce that knowledge. So keep in mind that this lecture is going to be awesome and fun and just wildly entertaining, as I'm sure you are expecting. But at the end of the lecture, you will probably know more about commas than you did at the beginning, but you will not be at that finish line unless you are really, really close to the finish line going forward. Like most grammar and punctuation issues, we really master it, we really learn it by doing it, by challenging ourselves. Hearing a lecture about it, it's a little bit like hearing a lecture about riding a bicycle. I could lecture you all day about riding a bicycle, or let's imagine Lance Armstrong lectures you all day about riding a bicycle. But that's not the same as you actually riding a bicycle. And that's how grammar, and that's certainly how commas work. So see this as kind of getting your big toe in the water, but recognize that you're going to have to actually get in the water and actually use these skills day in, day out for several months. before you're even going to get to the point of, yeah, I've got this mastered. And even then, you're still going to want to have your resource. So I'm going to get off my soapbox now. We're going to get into the rules. The rules are listed in the green Aspen Handbook starting on page 34. In the red Aspen Handbook, they start on page 36. So whichever resource you have, if you would, pause me right now and go get that book and open it up to the right page. Okay, well, let's get started. Again, the rules are going to be stated a little bit differently depending upon the resource that you have, but for the most part, they're going to be the same sets of rules. Okay. Before we get started, let me talk about some optional issues. You'll see in these rules and in other resources that you might work with that there are some commas that are optional. And we'll talk more about those as we get to those. As a general rule of thumb, whichever resource you use to help you understand commas, if it's an optional comma, err on the side of using it. And we'll talk about specific commas that legal professionals, they may technically be optional, but they're virtually required in the legal world. So if you want to be safe, when you see some resource saying this is an optional comma, the safer approach is to go ahead and use it. And speaking of other resources, let me show you some. So here I am, here I am in our course. I'm in Module 9, which is currently the module that houses the comma material for the Advanced Legal Documents course. And there is a link here called Websites on Commas. And this is all that it is a list of websites. And you will see I have, like 417, I'm exaggerating, but lots of websites on this stuff. And I actually prefer many of these sites to our Aspen book. There aren't a lot of legal writing / grammar books available in the market. Aspen is good. It's not great. And its explanation of commas, in my opinion, is not great. Some of these resources, in my opinion, are better. Generally speaking, for grammar issues, just generally, I really like Towson. I also like Chomp Chomp a lot. Yeah, here's more Towson stuff. I also like Chop Chop. Purdue is good. And so those are just some good ideas. Some of these others are also good. I'm not saying that they're not good. Quick and Dirty is also good. So I have highlighted here the Towson one, which is called Module Comma, just to show you what that looks like. Here we go, and this is it. It breaks down the comma rules a little bit differently than what we have seen or what we'll be seeing in the Aspen book. There's nothing magical about Aspen's way of breaking it down. There's lots of different ways of separating and categorizing the things. And in my opinion, Aspen's is not the best, and I think there's some holes in how Aspen does it. It's good, it's just not great. So that's what we'll be using in this textbook, simply because you have the textbook. But don't feel that you can't use another resource that you might like better. Obviously, you don't want to go by, Bob's Fly-By-Night website. That's not going to work. But assuming it's from a university or college, or it's from a major publisher, you're going to be fine if you use that instead. Okay, so let's get to the book, the Aspen book, and we're going to start with Rule 1. You'll see that the rules aren't of equal importance or of equal complexity by any means. Some of these rules are going to be easy peasy. We're going to spend about five seconds on them. Some of them will be spending a lot more time. Let's look at Rule 1, which is one of the easy peasy rules. We are going to use a comma after the salutation in an informal, and read instead of informal. Read personal letter. In other words, we're not talking about something we are using in a business context. So the example that we have here is Dear Aunt Kay. We wouldn't be writing this anything that goes on law firm letterhead, because for letters, as you know, we use colon, which is a dot on top of a dot. But if you're writing, let's say you get married and you got some lovely wedding gifts, well, and you're writing to Dear Aunt Kay, you would do a comma. Even if you get a lovely wedding gift from the attorney with whom you work, And you might, let's say his name is Bob, you would say, Dear Bob, comma, because this isn't a professional letter, this is a personal letter, this is a thank you letter. And so the comma signals to the reader, this is personal. The colon signals to the reader, this is business. And so that's, again, that's one of the things that we're looking for when we're writing. We're trying to use punctuation to help the reader understand what he or she is reading, and this is one of the tools of it. So we won't be using the comma in the salutation in this course, but obviously all of us write from time to time personal correspondence, and it's useful to know that a comma goes there. We will be using this comma though. This is in the closing. Sincerely is a fine closing, sincerely, comma. The one that I also recommend is very truly yours. And we use a comma here even in business letters. And in fact, in all correspondence, use a comma after your closing. We capitalize the first word in our closing, the V in very, the S in sincerely, but not the T in truly and not the Y in yours. So we do use this part. Okay, that rule's pretty straightforward. Of course, if you forget it, just refer to the rules here. They're there to help you out. Let's look at Rule 2. Rule 2 is pretty straightforward, but there is a surprising wrinkle with this rule. So let's first of all talk about the rule, then we're going to talk about the wrinkle. When you have a date, and let's say you have the complete date. You have the day of the week, you have the month, you have the day, and then you have the year. Okay, so we put the day of the week first, then we put a comma, then we put the month, then we put, so we have, let me start again. We have the day of the week, which we capitalized that first letter. We put a comma, then a space. We put the month, we capitalized that first letter of the month, a space, then we put the number of which day of the month it is. We don't put a TH or an ND or an ST after it. So we don't say September 4th. We just say September 4. Then we put a comma and a space, then we put a year, and then we put a comma or some other form of punctuation. Now, in some countries, and I'm familiar with this from Europe, and there's probably other parts of the world that do this, the people will put the number in front of the month. And you know what? That makes better sense in our system. I completely concede that point. It is more logical, but it's just not what we do here. And so unless you are corresponding with somebody in one of those countries, don't do it. Do it in this format. Even if you're corresponding with someone from those countries, if your law firm's practice is to follow this form, I'd still follow this form. So definitely in the United States, this is the form we use. You certainly can add the day of the week, and it's smart to do so in the body of your letter. But if you're addressing a letter, we usually don't include the day of the week. So if this letter is going out on September 4, 2017, and this is the date you're putting, you would not put Monday on that. But if you're telling your client, hey, this is when the hearing is, it's a good idea to say Monday because that may be more memorable to the client than September 4 might be. Okay, so these commas are important. We don't put a comma between the month and the day. If I want to describe a particular month, let's say I want to say, we expect to go to trial in September 2017. I'm not giving you a specific date, I'm just saying that's where we think we'll go. There is no comma between September and 2017. Okay, now this is the wrinkle. This is the surprising thing that people will forget. And it looks weird. I'm going to just prep you for it. So I'm going to go ahead and open up. Let me just mark it first. Always put a comma after a full date when it appears within a sentence. Okay, so I'm going to show you what I mean with that because this is not intuitive. Go here, open, let's go for new. Okay, so here we have a sentence. Bob was born on July 15th, 1987, period. Okay, we nailed this. We have the month capitalized, space, the actual date. Notice I didn't do this, that's wrong. Comma, space, and then the year, and then terminal punctuation. That's fine. Let's go on and do another one. Bob was born on July 15th, 1987 in the morning. We need a comma here too. There has to be something after this 7. It can be a period, it can be a question mark, it can be pretty much any type of punctuation, but there has to be something. You never want to have a complete date and nothing at the end of the date. Now, if I had had just this is fine. We don't need anything. It's only when we have the complete date that we need to have something here. Now, we don't need a comma here for any other reason other than the fact that we have a complete date. So if when you look at the sentence, you're like, gosh, there's no period that belongs here, there's no question mark that belongs here, there's no semicolon or colon, nothing belongs here in terms of punctuation for any other reason other than Rule 2. Well, under those circumstances, then you put a comma because Rule 2. As we go through these rules, you'll see that there will be times where there will be multiple rules that tell you to put a comma. Obviously, you only put one comma, so that one comma might cover rules 2 and 7 and 19 or whatever, but just one comma. But even if no other rule says you need a comma after that 7, you need to have a comma. Let me show you another example. The July 15, 1987 meeting was long. This is how most people would write this. We have the month, capitalized, we have a space, we have the date, comma, we have a space, we have the year. This is functioning, this whole expression is functioning as an adjective. It's describing the meeting. This is actually the correct way of doing it though, because we always have to have a comma after the year. Now I will tell you, this looks weird. It looks wrong. Probably half of the people, maybe even more than half of the people who would read this sentence would think to themselves, that's an error. Either that's a typo or that writer doesn't know how to use commas. So even though you're following the rule by doing this, you are potentially confusing the reader or making the reader think that you're committing an error that you're not. So while this is correct, I don't recommend you do it. I don't recommend you leave off the comma because that's wrong. So if you're going to do it this way. But I would recommend that you rewrite it to say the meeting on July 15, 1987 was long. People aren't going to react and say that this comma looks bad to them. This is correct, but looks weird. This would be correct and looks normal. So this is the one that I would recommend that you go with. Okay, so just keep in mind, this tells you need a comma here or some type of punctuation. Let's go back to our rules. Okay, so that's the surprise. You always have to have a comma after a full date. When they say a full date, they mean this. You don't need the day of the week. The full date is the month, the day, and the year. Let's go to Rule 3. This has to do with how we're going to do an address. We need to have a comma between the city and the state, and after the address as a whole when the address is in a sentence. We don't put a comma between the state and the zip code. So let's look at this example. We see that between the city of Cleveland, which is a city, and the state of Ohio, there's a comma, so that is correct. And after the entire address, we have a comma. That is correct. There is no comma between Ohio and the zip code. This comma here is only located here because of rule 3. There's no other rule. So you always put this comma here. So you can imagine a quirky situation like we just covered here with the date. The, let me just get that house. Let's see. Let me just copy this. Copy. This is technically a correct sentence, but it's grammatically correct sentence, but it's poorly written. This is acting as a modifier as an adjective describing the house. We know we always need to have some type of punctuation at the end of a date, so we're going with a comma. But it looks like an error. It has the same problem that we have here. So it's better to even though this is correct, it's better to rewrite it this way. The house on was for sale. Because this is correct and it also will look correct to virtually everybody. So that's just a pointer about you want your comma usage to be correct, to help the reader understand the material, and to create in the reader a positive impression about your competency. And usually correct comma usage does all three of those things, but occasionally, in the example of this sentence and this sentence, even when you're being correct, it can create a belief in the reader that you're not, and so you don't want to do that. So that is rule 3. Let's go on to rule 4. This is a rule that I disagree with Aspen about. So I am going to ask you to use the Bluebook rule instead of the Aspen rule. You are probably more familiar with the Aspen rule than with the Bluebook rule. The Aspen rule is that when you have a 4-digit number, you put a comma between the first digit and the second digit. The Bluebook says, though, you don't. So let me just give you an example. The Bluebook would say, let's see, there are in the book, there are 9,543 pages in the book. So this is correct according to the Bluebook. Aspen would say that this is the way. But we are going to say correct for this class, because the Bluebook is the legal resource that is more widely accepted, has more status, so to speak, than Aspen does. So we're going to follow the more commonly used resource in the legal community. But this is the only difference. Let me give you another example. Let's go back to this one. So if we had this number, there are 91,543 pages in the book. Everyone would agree we should put a comma there. No disagreement about this situation. Okay, so it's only when there's 4 digits that there's a difference in custom. This is the one that you should follow for this class. So that's my one caveat about our rules that we'll be seeing. I don't disagree with Aspen that Aspen's rule is better than the Bluebook rule, but the Bluebook rule is just the gold standard in this area. So let's follow the Bluebook in this course. Okay, I'm going to skip rule 5 right now. We'll be returning to that rule. I'm skipping it because rule 5 is big. It's a really important rule. We're going to skip rule 6. We're going to talk about rule 7. Okay. Rule 7. Use a comma to separate two or more consecutive adjectives that equally describe the same word. If you could use the word "and" between the adjectives, use a comma. Okay. Allison was a fearful, anxious witness. Could we say, Allison was a fearful and anxious witness? We sure could. That makes sense to our English speaker ear. So in that situation, because we could put an "and" between these two words, we're going to put a comma to separate them. Let me just make a note. This is not the serial comma that we're going to be talking about in a little bit. This is the adjective comma rule. Okay, so let's write that up. I'm going to mark this. So we can do this. We can say Allison was a fearful and anxious witness. So since we can do that, we can also do this. Both of these are correct. If we keep the "and" in here, we don't put a comma. Okay, let's go on to Rule 9. This is the serial comma rule. This is when you have a list of items. If you have only 2 items in the list, let me give an example of that. Bob went to the store to buy milk and eggs. Okay, there's just 2 items on our list. We have milk, item 1. We have eggs, item 2. So we don't have enough. We need to have at least 3 items in our list before we think about commas. So this is correctly punctuated. We do not put a comma on this one. But let's say that Bob decides, oh, I need also a loaf of bread. So I'm going to put bread in here. Bread. Okay, so now we have 3 items in the list. Let me mark this. Because we have 3 items, we need some commas. We absolutely have to have a comma between our first item and our second item. Between our second item and our conjunction here, this comma is technically optional. There's a special name for this comma. Some people call it the Oxford comma, and that's what we're going to call it in this course. Oops, I'm sorry. So in the example, the bread comma is called the Oxford comma. If you are not a grammar / punctuation nerd, you may not have heard of this before, but people have really, really strong opinions about Oxford commas. I would say most grammar nerds are staunchly in favor of the Oxford comma. And I am too. So while it's technically, it is optional, but highly recommended. It adds to the understanding of the sentence. And I'll give you some examples of how it can result in confusion if you don't have it in a second. Let me first of all talk about the people who don't want to use the Oxford comma. Mainly the people who don't want to use it are publishers because it takes up an extra space. And so if there are enough Oxford commas in a document, it can actually cause the book to have one or more pages than it otherwise would. It also, takes up a little bit of ink. Each one of those commas costs a little bit of money for the publisher. And so that's the main reason why publishers oftentimes don't use it. So if you're looking in a magazine or a newspaper or even in published books, you will see many times that the Oxford comma is omitted. Not so much because the publisher thinks it's a bad idea, but because the publisher wants to save a little bit of money. So you will have seen many times in your life this comma not being here, and you will have seen it this way. And as I said before, it's not wrong not to have the comma, but most people prefer it. And more people prefer it than not by a significant number, especially in the legal community. And those who prefer it, many of them are staunchly favored this position. And so as a result, leaving off that comma, and this is going to sound weird, but leaving off the comma can tick people off. So you don't want to do that. Okay, let me see. Let me give you an example. Bob went to the store to buy milk, pork, and beans. Okay, looking at this, it's unclear whether Bob is buying two products, a gallon of milk and a can of Van de Kamp's pork and beans, or whether he's buying milk, some pork, maybe some pork chops, and a can of beans. So this is ambiguous. Now, if we take the interpretation that this is a can of pork and beans, you would be right to say, well, if this is one unit and this is one unit, then the writer should have written it this way, right? Because our rule was when there's just two items on our list, you're supposed to not use commas, and that's true. But most readers know that sometimes writers mess up. And so the reader might be thinking, maybe this writer messed up and shouldn't have used that initial comma. And Bob really was buying a can of pork and beans and a gallon of milk. So you've at least created a heartbeat of confusion in the mind of the reader. He's not quite sure what Bob came home with under those circumstances. But if you do this, put a comma here, he's pretty confident that Bob bought some pork chops and either fresh beans, maybe some green beans, or maybe it is a can of beans, maybe even with some pork in it. But this is going to make the reader feel more confident that he knows what was purchased. And so the comma helps, again, separate those units, and you know exactly how many units there are. So I definitely encourage you to use the Oxford comma. And for this course, even though it's in theory an optional comma, it is considered required because I will take off points if you leave off that Oxford comma. Okay. So let's look at Rule 9. Use commas as separate items in a series of 3 or more. So let me just go and show you how we would make a fourth item. So Bob is buying milk, bread, cheese, and eggs. And let's say he's also buying coffee, and he's buying tortillas, and he's buying chicken, and he's buying olives and tomatoes. You get the gist of it. Strawberries. You can make the list as long as you want. Every item is going to have a comma after it. And then if the list is cumulative, you're going to say and. If Bob is buying all of these items, our next to last item, the penultimate item, will have a comma, space, and then we have our ultimate or final item. If it's optional, in other words, Bob is going to buy one of these items, maybe more than one, but he's not sure that he's going to buy them all, then we would say or, meaning he's going to definitely buy one of these. He might buy more than one, but he's definitely going to buy one. Most of the time you'll see that it's going to be an and situation, but it can certainly be an or situation. Whether it's or or and, we're going to punctuate it the same way. Let's look at the examples from the textbook. Let's first of all talk about the Oxford comma. Although the final comma in a series called the Oxford comma, serial comma, is optional in most writing and is omitted in newspapers to save space, in legal writing it is required. So again, this textbook is just saying it's required for legal writing, and I think that's a fair statement. For example, let's consider the following sentences. I leave all my property in equal shares to Jim. He's our first one on the list. To Helen. To Tim. And to Eva. So we have 4 people on our list. Okay, so each one is getting 25% of my assets. But in this case, it's a little bit ambiguous. Jim is our first person. Helen is still our second person. I mean, the order of the names hasn't changed. But it's unclear whether Jim and Eva are one unit or not. So one interpretation of this is that Jim is getting 33 1/3%, Helen is getting 33 1/3%, and Tim and Eva together are getting 33 1/3%. I guess each one would be getting, I guess that'd be about 16, 17%. So that could be a point of confusion. Now you might say, but well, there should be an and here before Tim if that's what was meant. You're right. So there would be an argument that Tim and Eva could advance that, well, really they're both entitled to 25% because there's no comma here, which is what you would ordinarily expect. But Jim and Helen would have another argument. Well, why was this comma right here dropped? So you don't want to do that. You don't want to be in a position you want to include the comma. Let's look at this. To my parents, the Pope and Mother Teresa. Written this way, it sounds like that we have a positive. We have a parents, we have a mother and a father. Well, if the Pope married Mother Teresa, we would have a father and a mother. Obviously, what the writer almost certainly meant was he is trying to thank his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the Pope, who isn't his father, and Mother Teresa, who isn't his mother. So he is intending to thank 4 different people. So always remember that you want to include it so you don't have any ambiguity, and we need to have that Oxford comma to get rid of that. So this is, initially I was talking about the fact that some commas are optional, and if you look, for example, at Towson, probably it will say that the serial comma or the Oxford comma is optional, but just consider it a requirement for legal writing. We'll talk about 10 in a few minutes. Let's talk about Rule 12. Use a comma before and after quotes beginning or ending with words as he said or she said. Okay, and I'm going to just copy and paste these in here so we can look at these in a little bit more detail. Let's look how these are structured. We've already talked about quotations in other contexts. When we lead with this introductory statement, it doesn't have to be said. It could be, she screamed, or perhaps she whispered, or maybe she asked, or maybe she sighed. Or she could have signed. Maybe she's using sign language, right? Any of these introductory expressions, whatever it is that is introducing this quote, we say it, then a comma, then a space, open quotes, whatever our sentence is, punctuation within the quotes, and then we close quotes. Okay? Let's flip it around. We're going to say the same thing, but now we're going to have, instead of it being an introductory expression, we're going to have it be an end. same thing. Open quotes, we have our statement. We're going to use a comma here. The only time we wouldn't use a comma would be if we were going to use a question mark, because this is a literal question in here, or an exclamation point. If a period would ordinarily go here, we don't want to put a period because we're not done with the sentence. So we'd put a comma instead of a period. And so we're going to have a comma, close quotes, space, and then we're going to say she. Again, it could be yelled, period, or whispered, or whatever. Okay, sometimes we use this statement as an interruptive in the middle of our quote. And this is what we have here. So what the quote really is this. The decision of the lower court is reversed and the cases are remanded to the lower court to proceed according to this decision. We know that Judge Allen made this statement. We could have started with it. Let's just try that here. Judge Allen stated, comma, space. We'll talk about this comma in a bit. Right, so we could have done like this, or we could put it at the end. Since we're closing it with a period. And you could say either Judge Allen stated, or we could say stated Judge Allen. Either one is fine. But what we did is we put it in the middle, which is also okay. I'm not sure I like this for legal writing as much as it might be good, say, for fiction writing or something like that, because you're interrupting yourself. You're reading Judge Allen's quote, and then you suddenly interrupt that sentence to say something else. So I'm not sure this is the most effective way to do it. Let's look at how we're doing it. So we open quotes, we have the beginning of the quote, we're going to put a comma here. You're going to choose a place to break your quote that is logical. So where a period would be, or where a comma would be, or some other punctuation like that is a smart place to do so. But whether it's whether you'd put a period here or a comma, you're going to go with a comma here. And again, if it were a question mark, and you know, maybe you had a lengthy, several sentence long thing, and you're copying a large portion of it, well, under that situation, you could keep the question mark here, but probably that's not going to happen a lot. So you're going to have a comma in most cases, close quotes, then you're going to have Judge Allen stated or stated Judge Allen, and now you're going to have a comma, space, open quotes, and since we're continuing the sentence, this is the same sentence, we're not capitalizing this word, then we're going to have the terminal punctuation and close quotes. Now, if this really were a complete sentence, so I'm going to set it up that way. So let's say that Judge Allen's original document looked like this. Okay, so this is how it was originally written. This is how we're going to punctuate this. Everything is going to look the same up until Allen, but because this is a complete sentence right here, we're going to change this to a comma, to a period. So this is our signal that this is a complete sentence. This period tells that this is complete. Then we have to capitalize the next word because this is a complete sentence. We're starting a new sentence. If we go back, and this is the original document, then we need to have a comma here, and we need to say, oops, and the case. So we'll have two indications that this isn't a complete sentence, this comma and this lack of capital letter in that place. So again, if this is confusing for you, and there's a fair number of students I see who do get thrown by this, go ahead and check this rule every time that you use this. I will flag something for you, and that is that other countries do this in different ways. So if you grew up or commonly read material that was published in a different country, even could be an English-speaking country, they may punctuate it in very different ways. And this is one of these rules that it's not so much a logic rule, it's a what are you familiar with type of rule. So if you're used to seeing it a different way, you're not in a position to rely upon kind of your memory to point you in the right direction, because what is wrong will look right to you just because of the experience of reading that document from another place. Okay, so we are ending the rules here. And so at this point, I am going to end this lecture, and then we will go back and cover the additional, more complicated rules in another lecture. Thank you for your attention, and have a wonderful day.